Welcome to Newshour. Canada is fighting back. After an onslaught of tariffs, jokes and online tirades from US President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has vowed to conduct what he called a relentless fight to protect the Canadian economy, describing 25% Trump tariffs as a very dumb thing to do. Now, in the last few hours, markets have been buoyed by news of a temporary reprieve, with President Trump agreeing a one-month exemption to tariffs on car imports after pleas from Ford, General Motors and Stellantis, companies all of whom have supply chains spanning across North America. But the bad feeling has not gone away, and the fallout has moved far beyond the domain of politicians and policymakers. Citizens too seem pretty angry, from coffee shop owners replacing Americanos with Canadianos to protests against being called the 51st state. Canadians seem united in their disdain for recent events. Let's hear from just a few comments from people out and about earlier today in Montreal.
I think it's mostly fear and incomprehension between why now starting this. It will cost jobs, money, there's no benefit for either country.
It'll impact the consumer first and foremost, make everything more expensive. I think both sides of the border, even though it hurt us more than it hurt the US. It'll hurt our dollar, making again everything more expensive, adding inflationary pressure to us. So I don't think it's a way of going about doing business with your largest trading partner.
Well, I'm delighted to say we have another Canadian in the studio with us tonight in the form of our distinguished anchor and analyst, Anita Sharma. Anita, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure as always, Guy.
Now, I know this is politically, professionally very interesting, but it also must, for you, be personal too.
Yeah, it's a surreal situation right now, Guy. You know, when you put your journalist hat on, and to your point, you cover it. You cover the political ramifications, the market implications, and which I'm sure we'll get to later in this chat. But from a personal standpoint, my goodness, just to see how all this is playing out. We've always seen the United States, being Canadian, we've always seen the United States as sort of the big brother. Sometimes you fight, sometimes you get along, most of the time you get along, but it's just a lot of good jest, good humor between the two. What's happened now with the talk of the 51st state, calling the Prime Minister of Canada a governor, maybe funny the first time, maybe. But now at this point, having that call today, that 50-minute chat with Justin Trudeau, essentially calling him a governor again and saying, good luck, Justin. It's a lot to handle. And you're seeing the boycotts now from coast to coast to coast in Canada. You have a premier, ironically enough, Doug Ford, the premier of the province I come from, Ontario. When he came to power years ago, he's now won his third straight majority, by the way, just a sweeping victory a few days ago. When he first came to power, he was ridiculed for being the Canadian Donald Trump. But now people brought him into office as quickly as they could because he too, like you said off the top about Justin Trudeau's comments, said, and I quote, tariffs against Canada are the craziest idea. He promises to fight back. He's going to hike taxes on electricity that goes to American states that use Canadian power from Ontario. And he's also taking alcohol off the shelves. May not seem like a big deal to take American-based alcohol off your shelves in Canada or in Ontario, but it's something, right? It just points to a grave problem.
And you're right, Anita, the line of what's normal, what's acceptable, just seems to keep moving.
It's very bizarre, isn't it, Guy? I mean, when you watch what happened in the White House on Friday, when you see the interactions Donald Trump has had with Justin Trudeau, these are leaders of states. And to see all of this theater play out on the grand stage, it is quite bizarre, just to use that word again. And again, on a personal level, when I'm having phone calls and chats with my friends, my family, my colleagues, we are genuinely wondering, what is going to come next? How is this going to hit us economically? How is this going to hit us on every level possible? So it's a very nervous time to be Canadian. And the world is watching, right? I interviewed Jonathan Miller of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute yesterday, and he said, Anita, it's Canada for now. It's Canada right now, and Mexico and China. But the world is next. The rest of the world will be also in the eye of the tiger, Donald Trump.
Well, let's get a view from the other side of the border now and speak to A News's Ube Shahbanda, who is in Washington, D.C. for us. Ube, thanks very much for joining us. Set the scene for us then. We've had the comments, the tariffs, now the reprieve. What's the latest situation in Washington?
Well, the Trump administration is doubling down. We heard earlier from President Trump's senior economic counselor, Peter Navarro, saying that Canada, the fentanyl that is coming across the border from Canada continues to kill Americans, and that Canada is being taken over by Mexican cartels. You know, that was in response to the criticism that the Trump administration is receiving for the additional 25% tariffs that the administration has imposed on Canada and Mexico. However, only a smaller tariff of only 10% is being put on Canada's energy exports, given that Canada relies so much on those energy exports to the United States for its economy. So the Trump administration clearly is not backing down. We saw from very little sort of change following that long phone call between Presidents Trump and, of course, Prime Minister Trudeau. President Trump said afterwards that the call ended in a, quote, somewhat friendly manner, which is usually a signal that the call probably did not go very well. And of course, President Trump doubled down on the accusations that Trudeau is not doing enough to put a halt on the smuggling of fentanyl, which is produced in mass quantities in China, then shipped to Mexico and Canada, and then so that the U.S. leaders still saying that, look, we've expressed our concerns to Prime Minister Trudeau. You have all this fentanyl crossing America's northern border into the U.S., and we're just not seeing any real action by Canada's leader on this front. And look, the statistics that the U.S. leaders cite are sobering. Millions of Americans addicted to fentanyl-laced products and being killed due to overdoses. So on one hand, it's an economic issue with President Trump saying that these tariffs are being imposed on Canada and Mexico because of unfair trade practices. Of course, Canada being the largest trading partner of the United States, and then Mexico right after that. But also a national security issue. So the Trump administration has turned the tariffs on Canada as being primarily being driven by national security concerns, given the concerns of that fentanyl, which is a chemical precursor that's produced in mass quantities in China. And then what happens is then it's shipped and smuggled to Canada and Mexico, and then it's laced with pills and other drugs that are then sold to the U.S. That this is really an issue of, it's not just a matter of dollars and cents, but a matter of millions of American lives. So really you're seeing an entrenchment on both the American side and the Canadian side. And the Canadians have come out and said, look, it's either zero tariffs or nothing. The Canadian finance minister is saying that, look, we're not willing to meet somewhere in the middle. Either the U.S. ends all of its tariffs on Canada, or you're not going to see any compromise on the Canadian side in terms of the retaliatory tariffs. And that has been a big economic concern for the United States that we saw following the meetings that Ford and General Motors, these big companies, automaker companies, had with the Trump administration. That resulted in the Trump administration putting a 1-month reprieve for those automakers because they received so many of their spare parts from Canada and Mexico. And so that is those tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs were going to significantly impact auto manufacturers. And of course, it's been a major political priority for the Trump administration to protect the American auto manufacturing industry and to keep those jobs here at home in the United States.
Absolutely, Ube. On the auto tariff front, you had a spokesperson, rather the press secretary of Donald Trump, essentially saying that he told the CEOs of those car companies that they're going to have to bring home the jobs, right? If they want to avoid tariffs after the reprieve, the 1 month reprieve that you talked about, they're going to have to bring those jobs back to the United States. As we say back home, them's fighting words, right? We'll have to see how all that plays out. You talk about Donald Trump being very emboldened. Prime Minister Trudeau also seems emboldened too, right? As the outgoing prime minister, just days ahead of an election, electing the new party, the new leader of the Liberal Party, which will happen on Sunday. He's emboldened. This is almost energized, if you will, the Liberal Party of Canada, as they also get ready to go to the polls, the national polls, and win back the Canadian vote, to stay in power as what they see as now Canada's natural governing party. So my question to you is, where do you think Justin Trudeau stands here in this battle with Donald Trump? You've got barbs being exchanged from both sides in this tariff war, right?
Yeah, that's the thing with tariffs. You're going to face retaliatory tariffs. So the question is, who has the highest tolerance for economic pain? We've seen markets fluctuate in the U.S. following President Trump's speech to Congress, where he said, look, these tariffs are happening. Yeah. There is not going to be a reprieve. There's not going to be yet another delay. And we've seen, markets reacting to that. And President Trump, when he spoke to the joint session of Congress, said there is going to be short-term pain. He acknowledged that, but he said that, look, tariffs, that's his favorite word in the U.S. dictionary. And in the long run, in the view of President Trump, it's going to be better to keep American jobs, for American job growth, and for the U.S. economy. And that, in the worldview of President Trump and his economic advisors, that in the long term, despite the short-term shocks to the system and the short-term economic pain, that in the long term, tariffs will bring more money into the American treasury. So look, the U.S. has the benefit of being the largest economy in the world at about $20 trillion in terms of the GDP. Canada, about $1.7 trillion GDP. And the question is that which country's economy is more reliant on the other? So what happens, usually when you launch these big tariffs, and of course the 25% that the U.S. has now imposed on Canada and Mexico, you're seeing the retaliatory tariffs. So you're going to have an impact on the American economy, but also it's going to impact inflation on the Canadian side as well. So the question is, which world leader, President Trump or Trudeau, will back down first? Look, Trump doesn't have the history of backing down. And again, you have the advantage of the U.S. being a significantly larger economy than Canada. And more, and the view in Washington is that the Canadian economy is much more dependent on the U.S. That being said, Canada is still, the largest trading partner of the United States, and a significant amount of energy exports into the U.S. come from Canada. And that is why President Trump only put a 10% tariffs on Canadian energy exports, because that would mean Americans paying more for their energy bills in the middle of winter. And of course, no one likes that, given that President Trump was elected on a mandate partially to lower costs to the American consumer. And certainly, President Trump is not backing down from referring to Prime Minister Trudeau as Governor Trudeau. And, it may have been said in jest the first few times, but it's clearly indicative that President Trump doesn't think much of Prime Minister Trudeau's political legitimacy.
Yeah, and on the energy front, great points all the way around from both of you gentlemen, but on the energy front, it's almost emboldening, to use that word again, Canadians from coast to coast to coast who are saying, wait a second, why are we sending our oil south to the United States? Why don't we open that interprovincial trade from east to west and send that oil out to the Pacific, towards the west, and towards the east, towards Europe? So let's see how all that plays out. There's no question that all of this turmoil oil has upended markets. We're seeing volatility on the New York Stock Exchange as we speak, with traders really not sure. It's deja vu like we saw in the first administration. Traders really not sure how to play this. And we know, Guy, when traders are unsure, they really just sit on their hands and wait for better days and less stormy waters. Right, Guy and Ube?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that, it's an old adage, isn't it? There's nothing that markets hate more than uncertainty, and that's certainly something that we have here with this this situation. I'd be interested, though, Ube, to just, if we could look forward. Obviously, this has been a tumultuous affair, but let's look forward now. President Trump has an awful lot to do on his to-do list, in his in-tray. Give me your sense of how things might pan out then over the next few months between the US and Canada.
Well, I think, look, the fact that the auto manufacturers only have a month to, bring home their supply chain, that might be a very ambitious timeline. And you might very well see that after a month, General Motors and Ford, which employ thousands of Americans, might go back to the White House and tell Presidents Trump and his Commerce Secretary and his principal economic counselor that we need more time. Supply chains for auto manufacturers are incredibly complex, and you may end up losing more jobs or factories, slowing down or shutting down, or of course transferring the cost of their of the supply chain to the consumer. So then the consumer ends up having to pay more for American products and cars. So the question is that how can you, this is on a massive scale, domesticate the supply chain, the global supply chain of spare parts back to the US homeland without an over dependency on external supplies. And I think that might prove to be more difficult than initially intended. But President Trump's view is that, well, look, you have to start somewhere, right? And so I don't see President Trump backing down in the near future on these tariffs, despite economic volatility, particularly in the markets. I think the view from the White House is that the markets will eventually consolidate. They'll get used to this new normal of President Trump's economic policy down the line, and that you have to just sort of weather the storm. Because at the same time, President Trump has also said that he's going to unleash American energy. So the perspective of President Trump and his administration is that once you unleash American energy exports, including liquefied natural gas exports, that will offer a backstop to any inflationary shock that may result from these tariffs on Mexico and Canada.
Well, there's certainly more, I'm sure, that will play out in this incredibly interesting affair. Thanks, Ube, very much for joining us. Thank you to Anita for being with us in the studio. And that is all we have time for on this edition of Newshour tonight. Please stay with us for more news and analysis. And from all of us here in Baku, thank you for watching.